The last rays of sunset glinted off the aluminum skin of the B-29 superfortress as it skimmed low over the inky waters of Shimonoseki Strait on April 27, 1945. Inside the cramped bomb bay, cylindrical Mark 26 acoustic mines hung ready for deployment. At precisely 20:43, the bombardier pressed the release switch. One by one, the mines plunged into the dark waters below, disappearing beneath the surface with barely a splash. Within hours, 3 Japanese cargo ships would strike these silent killers, adding to the growing list of vessels that would never reach their destinations. For Japan's war machine, desperately short of resources, each sunken ship represented another nail in the coffin of their imperial ambitions. What these aircrews were accomplishing, with far less fanfare than their counterparts dropping high explosives on Japanese cities, was nothing short of the methodical strangulation of an entire nation. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. The story of America's aerial mining campaign against Japan during World War II remains one of the most devastatingly effective, yet least recognized operations in modern military history. While the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki understandably dominate historical narratives about the war's conclusion, a more subtle campaign was simultaneously unfolding, one that might have ended the war even without the atomic bombs. Operation Starvation, as it was aptly named, represented the culmination of years of strategic thinking and technological development, transforming the humble naval mine from a defensive tool into a strategic weapon deployed from the world's most advanced bomber. By early 1945, Japan stood as an island nation increasingly cut off from its empire and essential resources. Its once mighty navy was in shambles after defeats at Midway, Leyte Gulf, and the Philippine Sea. The Imperial Japanese Army found itself scattered across the Pacific, with units isolated and starving on bypassed islands. Japan's industrial heartland remained dependent on a steady flow of resources: coal from Manchuria, bauxite from Malaysia, rubber from Indonesia, rice from occupied territories, all of which had to cross increasingly dangerous waters to reach the home islands. Despite these vulnerabilities, Japan maintained a complex network of shipping lanes that kept its war economy functioning, if barely. The roots of Operation Starvation traced back to the early days of the war. In December 1941, just days after Pearl Harbor, Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, had contemplated how to leverage America's industrial might against Japan's inherent geographical vulnerability. Japan's economy depends on shipping, he noted to his staff. Their island nature makes them uniquely vulnerable to naval blockade. What made the aerial mining campaign revolutionary wasn't the concept. Naval mines had been deployed since at least the American Civil War, but rather the delivery method and systematic approach to deployment. Lieutenant General Curtis LeMay, commander of the Von Bomber Command based on the Mariana Islands, initially viewed mining operations with skepticism. His B-29s were designed to deliver high-explosive payloads against industrial targets, not to drop mines into harbors. Yet LeMay was nothing if not a pragmatist, and when presented with analysis suggesting that mining could produce outsized results for minimal cost, he approved a test operation. The results were immediately impressive. With just 12 B-29s and 113 mines dropped during the first mission against Shimonoseki Strait on March 27, 1945, the U.S. managed to sink or damage 12 ships. Commander James S. Russell, tasked with planning the mining operations, brought scientific rigor to what had previously been considered a secondary mission. Russell consulted oceanographers, studied tidal patterns and Japanese shipping schedules, and developed a comprehensive understanding of Japan's maritime choke points. His approach transformed mining from a random act of dropping explosives into the water to a precisely calculated campaign designed to maximize disruption with minimal resources. The mines don't need to sink every ship, Russell explained to his staff. They just need to make the Japanese believe any channel might contain mines. For the Japanese, the suddenness and technological sophistication of the mining campaign came as a shock. Since the Russo-Japanese War 4 decades earlier, the Imperial Japanese Navy had prided itself on mine-clearing operations. Yet the American mines deployed in 1945 represented a quantum leap in technology. Acoustic mines activated by ship propeller sounds, magnetic mines triggered by a vessel's metal hull, and pressure mines set off by water displacement from passing ships, all confused and overwhelmed Japan's limited mine-sweeping capabilities. Captain Kyuzo Tamura of the Japanese mine-sweeping fleet recalled in post-war interviews the growing sense of futility. Each morning we would clear a channel, only to find the Americans had seeded it again overnight. Our equipment could detect the older mines, but proved useless against the newer American types. We were fighting blind, while our merchant captains faced impossible choices: remain in port and starve the country, or sail and risk destruction. The human drama unfolding on Japan's merchant vessels was equally compelling. By 1945, experienced mariners had become a precious resource, with thousands already lost to submarine attacks and air raids. Masao Watanabe, a merchant sailor who survived the sinking of his coal carrier after striking a mine in the inland sea, described the psychological impact. We began to see the water itself as the enemy. At least with submarines or aircraft, you could sometimes see them coming. With mines, death lurked silently beneath us, waiting. Many sailors began to refuse assignments to certain routes known to be mined, despite the severe penalties for such refusal. The mining campaign accelerated through the spring of 1945, with the scope and sophistication increasing monthly. On May 3rd, a particularly ambitious mission saw 92 B-29s drop 119 mines in a single night, focusing on multiple harbors and shipping channels simultaneously. The carefully orchestrated operation overwhelmed Japanese countermeasures and created a bottleneck that paralyzed shipping throughout the inland sea region for nearly a week. Behind the operational success lay remarkable technological innovation. The mines themselves represented cutting-edge military technology. The Mark 25 mine, equipped with magnetic sensors, could detect the metal hull of a passing ship and detonate accordingly. The Mark 36 mine contained sophisticated acoustic sensors that could identify the specific sound patterns of ship propellers. Perhaps most ingenious was the Mark 13 pressure mine, which detonated when it detected the temporary drop in water pressure created by a ship passing overhead, making it virtually impossible to sweep using conventional methods. The campaign's effectiveness derived not just from technology but from psychological warfare elements inherent in mining operations. Commander Russell understood that actual sinkings represented only part of the equation. Equally important was the disruption caused by fear and uncertainty. The Americans deliberately varied their mine types, deployment patterns, and timing to prevent the Japanese from developing effective countermeasures. Occasionally, they would mine an unimportant area, wait for the Japanese to commit scarce mine-sweeping resources to clear it, then mine it again immediately afterward. This war of nerves compounded the physical damage, creating a multiplication effect far beyond the resources committed. From their base on Tinian in the Mariana Islands, the B-29 crews of the 313th Bombardment Wing adapted to their specialized role with characteristic American ingenuity. The mine-laying missions presented unique challenges compared to high-altitude bombing. To avoid detection and anti-aircraft fire, the massive bombers would approach Japanese waters at wave-top height, often just 200 to 300 feet above the ocean surface. This low-altitude flying strained both aircraft and crews, with the constant turbulence causing fatigue and the proximity to water increasing risk in case of mechanical failure. Technical Sergeant Robert Henderson, a flight engineer on a mine-laying B-29, described the harrowing nature of these missions. Flying that low at night, you couldn't see the water. You had to trust entirely in your instruments and the pilot's skill. One moment of inattention, one minor error in altitude, and we'd plow straight into the sea. The Japanese rarely spotted us, but that was small comfort when you're fighting to keep a 4-engine bomber just above the waves for hours on end. Despite the dangers, crews on mining missions enjoyed significantly higher survival rates than those conducting high-altitude bombing over Japanese cities. Anti-aircraft batteries were concentrated around urban and industrial targets, leaving many maritime approaches relatively undefended. Additionally, the mining aircraft typically approached under cover of darkness, further reducing the effectiveness of Japanese air defenses. For B-29 crews who had experienced the terror of flak-filled skies over Tokyo or Osaka, mine-laying missions often came as a welcome assignment. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Nelson, who commanded one of the mining squadrons, noted in his mission reports how quickly the mining operations evolved. What began as an experimental mission quickly proved its worth. Within weeks, we had refined our techniques to the point where a single aircraft could effectively mine a harbor entrance in a single pass. By varying fuse settings, mine types, and deployment patterns, we created a mine-sweeping nightmare for the Japanese that far exceeded the actual number of mines we were dropping. The impact on Japan's war economy proved immediate and severe. Coal shipments from Hokkaido to industrial centers on Honshu plummeted by 80% in April 1945, leaving factories without power and further crippling production. Oil imports, already reduced to a trickle by submarine warfare, virtually ceased as tankers refused to risk the mine-infested approaches to major ports. Food distribution networks collapsed in many areas, exacerbating civilian hardship and fueling discontent with the military government. Japanese military archives, examined after the war, revealed the extent of the crisis. A confidential report to Emperor Hirohito in June 1945 stated bluntly, "The mining of our ports and inland waterways presents a crisis potentially more severe than the direct bombing of our cities. While we can disperse factories or rebuild them, we cannot create alternative maritime routes. Each day that passes sees our strategic reserves further depleted with little hope of replenishment." For ordinary Japanese citizens, the effects manifested in increasingly severe rationing and shortages. By summer 1945, the average caloric intake in major cities had fallen below 1,500 calories per day, less than half the pre-war level. Industrial workers, despite priority access to food supplies, experienced declining productivity due to malnutrition. In Kobe, one of Japan's vital port cities frequently targeted by mining operations, hospital records showed a 300% increase in malnutrition-related ailments between January and July 1945. Miyoko Tanaka, a young woman working in a Kobe factory producing aircraft components, recorded in her diary the deteriorating conditions. Today, the factory manager announced another reduction in our lunch ration. There is talk that no rice shipments have reached the city for 2 weeks because of the mines. People are beginning to collapse at their workstations. Last week, Yamada-san fainted and cut her hand in a machine. The wounds would not heal properly because of her weakened condition. Behind these individual hardships lay cold strategic calculations. The U.S. mining campaign had been designed specifically to target the most critical choke points in Japan's maritime transportation network. The Shimonoseki Strait, connecting the inland sea with the Sea of Japan, handled nearly 80% of all shipping traffic between Japan's main islands. By heavily mining this narrow channel, American planners effectively created a maritime bottleneck that strangled the flow of resources throughout the Japanese home islands. Other priority targets included the approaches to Tokyo Bay, the inland sea entrances, and the harbors serving major industrial centers like Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. By July 1945, virtually every significant port in Japan had been mined at least once, with the most critical areas receiving repeated mining missions to counter Japanese minesweeping efforts. The cumulative effect created what U.S. naval intelligence described as a maritime siege of unprecedented effectiveness. For Japanese military leaders, the mining campaign created an impossible dilemma. Committing additional resources to mine sweeping would mean diverting vessels and personnel from other critical missions. Yet failing to clear the mines meant accepting the gradual strangulation of Japan's war economy. In a desperate move, the Imperial Japanese Navy converted several damaged destroyers into emergency minesweepers, but these improvised solutions proved inadequate against the sophisticated American mines. Admiral Toyoda Soemu, commander of the combined fleet, expressed his frustration in a May 1945 communication to Imperial headquarters. "We face an enemy who has found our most vulnerable point and is exploiting it with minimal investment of their own resources. Each mine they drop requires us to expend hundredfold effort to counter, all while our shipping capacity diminishes daily. This is a mathematical equation that ends only one way." The campaign's effectiveness can be measured in cold statistics. Between March and August 1945, aerial mines sank or damaged at least 670 Japanese vessels, totaling more than 1.2 million tons, roughly half of Japan's remaining merchant fleet. More significant than the direct losses was the paralysis imposed on the entire maritime transportation system. Ship movements declined by more than 90% in some areas, with captains refusing to sail without minesweeper escorts that simply weren't available in sufficient numbers. What made Operation Starvation particularly remarkable was its efficiency. The entire mining campaign consumed less than 6% of the B-29 combat sorties flown against Japan, yet it produced results comparable to the strategic bombing campaign that employed the vast majority of available aircraft. In terms of tonnage of Japanese shipping sunk per B-29 sortie, mines proved 21 times more effective than direct air attacks on ships. For every 1,000 mines dropped, approximately 17,000 tons of shipping were destroyed or damaged, an astonishing return on investment by any military standard. Captain Theodore Steinway, a naval intelligence officer who analyzed the campaign's effectiveness, observed, "The mining offensive represents perhaps the single most cost-effective strategic air operation in history. Each ton of mines dropped ultimately destroyed or immobilized more Japanese industrial capacity than 10 tons of high explosives dropped directly on factories." The secondary effects, port closures, shipping delays, resource shortages, multiplied the direct damage many times over. As July 1945 approached, the mining campaign entered its most devastating phase. American intelligence had by now developed a sophisticated understanding of Japan's remaining maritime capabilities and vulnerabilities. Mining missions were timed to coincide with Japanese minesweeping schedules, often reseeding channels just after they had been laboriously cleared. Fuse delays were programmed to activate some mines days or even weeks after deployment, creating persistent threat even in supposedly cleared waters. From a naval warfare perspective, the campaign represented a revolution in strategic thinking. Traditional blockades required committing surface vessels to patrol specific areas continuously, an approach that risked the blockading force and consumed enormous resources. The aerial mining campaign, by contrast, allowed a relatively small number of aircraft to create and maintain a blockade that no surface fleet could have accomplished with comparable resources. The mines, once deployed, required no further support, yet continued their silent vigil for weeks or months. The psychological impact on Japanese leadership proved equally significant. While the firebombing of cities created more immediate and visible destruction, the mining campaign generated a creeping sense of helplessness that proved psychologically devastating. Japan could and did disperse its industrial capacity to reduce vulnerability to bombing. No such countermeasure existed for the maritime blockade imposed by mines. Each passing day saw Japan's strategic position deteriorate further, with dwindling options for response. For the crews of the B-29s conducting these missions, their war took on a strange duality. Unlike their counterparts bombing cities, they rarely saw the direct results of their work. No massive explosions or firestorms marked their success. Just the quiet splash of mines entering water, followed by weeks of intelligence reports tallying ships immobilized or sunk. Lieutenant James Doolittle, a B-29 pilot who flew both conventional bombing and mining missions, reflected on this contrast. On a bombing run, you immediately knew if you'd hit your target. The mines were different. You dropped them and went home, never knowing exactly what they would accomplish. It required a different mindset, a faith that your unseen weapons were working silently beneath the waves long after you'd returned to base. The technical challenges of effective mine laying demanded unprecedented precision from B-29 crews. Mines had to be dropped from specific altitudes and speeds to ensure proper water entry without damage to sensitive mechanisms. Optimal mine spacing required accurate navigation and timing. Most critically, precise knowledge of water depths was essential, as mines deployed in water too shallow or too deep would prove ineffective. The 313th Bombardment Wing developed specialized training and equipment modifications to meet these unique requirements, transforming general-purpose bombers into precision mine delivery platforms. By late July 1945, as American planners contemplated the potential cost of a direct invasion of the Japanese home islands, the mining campaign was reaching its peak effectiveness. Japanese shipping had been reduced to desperate night runs between smaller, unmined ports, with many vessels hugging coastlines to minimize time in deeper waters. Coal stockpiles at major industrial centers had fallen to less than 2 weeks' supply. Steel production had declined to 20% of its 1944 levels, primarily due to resource shortages created by the mining blockade. In a fateful meeting on July 26th, Admiral Shigeyoshi Miwa, commander of Japan's submarine force and a respected naval strategist, delivered a devastating assessment to the Supreme War Council. Gentlemen, if the Americans continue their current rate of mining operations and we cannot develop more effective countermeasures, Japan's inter-island shipping will effectively cease by October. Without the movement of coal, food, and industrial materials between our islands, our capacity to continue the war, regardless of our will to do so, will end not with a decisive battle, but with a whimper of starvation and industrial paralysis. Miwa's assessment proved prescient. Within days of his warning, B-29s would drop another 1,500 mines in Japanese waters, focusing on the few remaining functional shipping routes. As August began, Japan's maritime transportation system teetered on the brink of complete collapse, a strategic catastrophe that would have rendered continued resistance impossible regardless of other factors. For a nation that had built its empire on maritime power, the sea itself had become an impassable barrier turned against them by American technological ingenuity. The daily reality for Japanese mariners had become a nightmare of uncertainty and fear. Captain Hiroshi Nakamura, who commanded one of the few tankers still operating in early August 1945, described the tension in his post-war memoir. Each voyage became a game of Russian roulette. We would receive reports of newly cleared channels, only to discover they had been mined again overnight. Minesweepers would lead us through supposedly safe passages, but often the mines had been set with delayed activation specifically to catch ships following the sweepers. Many crews began writing final letters before each departure, expecting they would not return. In port cities like Shimonoseki, Kobe, and Yokohama, the evidence of the mining campaign's effectiveness was impossible to ignore. Harbors once bustling with activity fell silent as ships refused to enter or leave. Those vessels that did arrive often brought tales of near misses or of witnessing other ships striking mines. Harbor pilots, once among the most respected maritime professionals, found their expertise rendered useless by the invisible threat lurking beneath familiar waters. Many resigned rather than accept the increasingly suicidal task of guiding vessels through mined channels. For ordinary citizens in Japan's coastal communities, the impact manifested in increasingly desperate food shortages. Fishing fleets, vital for supplementing the nation's protein intake, remained largely confined to port. When fishermen did venture out, they typically stayed in shallow waters close to shore, dramatically reducing their catch. In Fukuoka Prefecture, local government records indicate that fish protein availability declined by 78% between April and August 1945, primarily due to mining operations in nearby waters. Hiroyuki Agawa, a schoolteacher in a coastal village near Hiroshima, recorded the community's deterioration in his diary. The fishermen no longer go to their traditional grounds. 3 boats from neighboring villages struck mines last month. Now they fish only in the shallowest waters, returning with barely enough to feed their own families, with nothing left to distribute. The rice ration has been cut again. Children grow visibly thinner each week. Last night I heard old Tanaka-san telling his grandchildren stories about feasts from before the war. The children listened as though he were describing a fantasy world. The technological sophistication of the American mines compounded Japan's difficulties in countering the threat. The Mark 25 magnetic mine could be set to ignore the first several ships that passed overhead, detonating only when a vessel of particular magnetic signature, presumably a larger, more valuable target, crossed its position. The Mark 36 acoustic mine could distinguish between different propeller configurations, allowing it to target specific vessel types while ignoring others. Some mines were programmed to become temporarily dormant after nearby explosions, making coordinated sweeping operations ineffective. Commander Toshiyuki Yokoi, head of a mine-sweeping unit operating in the Inland Sea, described the technological gap. We were using equipment and techniques developed for mines from the previous war. Against the American acoustic and magnetic mines, we were practically helpless. We would detect and clear what we believed were all mines in a channel, only to have a ship strike one we had missed, or worse, one that had been specifically designed to evade our detection methods. It was like trying to catch shadows with a net. The Japanese attempted various countermeasures with limited success. They developed acoustic hammers that could be towed behind minesweepers to simulate ship propeller sounds, hoping to detonate acoustic mines at a safe distance. Metal-hulled vessels were equipped with degaussing equipment to reduce their magnetic signature. In extreme cases, wooden ships were employed to navigate suspected minefields, sacrificing speed and capacity for increased survivability. None of these approaches proved consistently effective against the variety and sophistication of American mines. Perhaps most telling was the Japanese Navy's desperate experiment with human minesweepers, sailors equipped with primitive diving gear who would physically search for mines in harbor approaches. This dangerous and inefficient approach reflected the growing desperation of Japanese military leaders faced with a threat they could neither effectively counter nor afford to ignore. Predictably, casualties among these human minesweepers were extremely high, with minimal impact on clearing operations. Back on Tinian Island, the American mining operation continued to evolve with ruthless efficiency. By July 1945, specialized mine assembly teams could prepare complex mine packages in hours rather than days. Each mine could be configured with specific sensitivity settings, activation delays, and anti-sweeping features based on the latest intelligence about Japanese countermeasures. The entire process had been streamlined to the point where a single B-29 squadron could effectively mine an entire harbor complex in one night, then return to different targets the following night. Major William Barter, who commanded one of the mine assembly units, noted the operation's growing sophistication. What began as essentially a naval operation conducted by air forces has evolved into a precisely choreographed campaign. We now tailor each mine settings to specific targets and conditions. Shallow harbors receive one configuration, deep shipping channels another. We can now predict with remarkable accuracy how long it will take the Japanese to sweep a particular minefield, allowing us to schedule re-mining operations for maximum disruption. The humanitarian impact of the campaign, while less visible than the destruction caused by conventional bombing, proved equally severe. As maritime shipping declined, food distribution within Japan became increasingly problematic. Urban areas, dependent on food imported from agricultural regions, suffered most acutely. Hospital records from major cities show sharp increases in malnutrition-related ailments through the summer of 1945, with children and the elderly particularly affected. In Tokyo, daily caloric intake for the average citizen had fallen to approximately 200 calories by August, a level associated with slow starvation. Factory workers, despite priority access to rations, experienced declining productivity due to hunger and related illnesses. Civil defense officials reported increasing incidents of food theft and black market activity, signs of the social fabric fraying under the pressure of sustained deprivation. Dr. Masatoshi Kimura, a physician who worked in a Tokyo hospital during this period, later recalled, "We began seeing diseases that had been rare in Japan: beriberi, scurvy, extreme protein deficiency. Children stopped growing, wounds wouldn't heal properly. The elderly simply wasted away." These were not dramatic deaths like those caused by bombing. They were slow, quiet, and insidious. And they were directly attributable to the collapse of our food distribution system, which in turn resulted from the mining of our waters. For Japan's military leadership, the mining campaign created strategic paralysis that extended beyond purely maritime considerations. As shipping became increasingly restricted, the movement of military units and equipment between islands became nearly impossible. Forces stationed on outlying islands found themselves effectively isolated, unable to be reinforced or withdrawn. Planning for the anticipated American invasion became an exercise in frustration, as commanders could not rely on their ability to reposition forces in response to landing sites. General Korichika Anami, Japan's Minister of War, acknowledged this crippling limitation in a confidential assessment prepared for the Supreme War Council in late July. "Our ability to maneuver our forces has been severely compromised by the enemy's mining operations. Units that should be redeployed to strengthen our southern defenses remain immobilized by lack of transport. Equipment vital for fortification work sits unused in northern depots while needed desperately in the south. The enemy has effectively frozen our pieces on the board while maintaining complete freedom of movement for their own." The psychological impact on Japanese military morale proved equally significant. For a nation with a proud maritime tradition dating back centuries, the inability to control their own coastal waters represented a profound humiliation. Naval officers trained in the tradition of decisive battle found themselves reduced to reactive measures against an enemy they could neither see nor effectively counter. The sense of helplessness contributed to growing fatalism among military leaders, a recognition that Japan had been outmatched not just in material resources, but in technological sophistication and strategic innovation. Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi, who would later become notorious for founding the kamikaze special attack units, expressed this sentiment in a private letter in July 1945. "We face an enemy who defeats us not through direct confrontation, but by exploiting our fundamental vulnerability as an island nation. They have turned the sea, traditionally our ally and protector, into an impenetrable barrier. This is not merely a military defeat, but a repudiation of our strategic assumptions about our national security." Operation Starvation's effectiveness demonstrated a fundamental truth about modern warfare that would influence military thinking for decades afterward. In an industrialized conflict, logistics often prove more decisive than tactical engagements. By targeting Japan's transportation infrastructure rather than its military forces directly, the mining campaign achieved strategic paralysis at minimal cost. Each mine represented a persistent threat that continued working long after the aircraft that delivered it had returned to base, creating a multiplier effect that conventional bombing could not match. Captain Ellis Zacharias, a U.S. Naval intelligence officer who helped plan the mining operations observed, "The beauty of the mining campaign was its inexorable mathematical logic. Each ship sunk represented not just a tactical loss, but a permanent reduction in Japan's logistical capacity. Unlike a factory, which could potentially be rebuilt, a lost ship in 1945 represented an irreplaceable asset." The cumulative effect of these losses created a downward spiral from which Japan's war economy could not recover. The technological innovations developed for Operation Starvation would influence naval warfare long after World War II ended. The concept of using sophisticated sensors and trigger mechanisms to create smart weapons that could distinguish between targets represented an early step toward the precision-guided munitions that would later revolutionize aerial warfare. The practice of programming weapons with delayed activation or variable sensitivity settings foreshadowed later developments in electronic warfare and countermeasures. For the U.S. military, the success of Operation Starvation offered important lessons about joint operations. What began as essentially a Navy concept using Navy-developed mines was executed by Army Air Forces bombers operating from land bases. This cross-service cooperation represented an early example of the integrated joint operations that would become standard military practice in later decades. The campaign demonstrated how specialized capabilities from different services could be combined to create effects greater than either service could have achieved independently. By early August 1945, as American leaders contemplated the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Operation Starvation had already pushed Japan to the brink of logistical collapse. Records from the Japanese Ministry of Transportation indicate that effective shipping capacity had declined by more than 60% since March, with the rate of decline accelerating. Coal deliveries to major industrial centers had fallen below the minimum needed to maintain essential power generation. Steel production, the backbone of the war economy, operated at less than 15% of capacity due to resource shortages. In this context, the atomic bombings, while undoubtedly significant psychologically, represented only one factor in a multiple crisis confronting Japanese leadership. The Soviet entry into the war, the systematic destruction of Japanese cities by conventional bombing, and the strangling effect of the mining campaign had created an interlocking series of calamities from which no recovery seemed possible. Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement on August 15, 1945, acknowledged this reality, referencing the general trends of the world that had turned against Japan. The immediate aftermath of the war revealed the full extent of the mining campaign's effectiveness. As Allied occupation forces arrived in Japan, they discovered warehouses empty of critical raw materials, factories idle for lack of coal, and a population suffering from widespread malnutrition. Japanese officials interviewed by U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey analysts consistently identified the mining campaign as among the most decisive factors in Japan's defeat. Some went so far as to suggest that continued mining alone might have forced surrender by late 1945, even without the atomic bombings or Soviet intervention. Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, who had served as Navy minister, stated bluntly, "Had the Americans concentrated exclusively on mining, the war would still have ended when it did. We were losing the ability to transport the minimal resources needed to continue resistance. The atomic bombs provided a convenient excuse for surrender, but our economic collapse was already inevitable due to the mining campaign and other forms of blockade." For the civilian population, the war's end brought gradual relief from the deprivations caused by the maritime blockade. American occupation authorities prioritized the reopening of key shipping lanes, employing both Japanese and Allied minesweepers in a massive clearance operation that would continue for nearly 2 years. Even with modern equipment and detailed maps of mine locations, the task proved enormously challenging, a testament to the effectiveness of the original deployment. Several vessels, including some involved in the clearance operations, were lost to mines that had remained undetected. Takeo Yoshikawa, a fisherman from Shimonoseki who participated in post-war minesweeping operations, described the psychological impact. Even years after the war, we approached the water with fear. Each time we took our boats out, we wondered if today would be the day we found a mine that had been overlooked. The Americans gave us maps showing where they had dropped mines, but we knew that currents could move them, or that some might have broken free from their moorings. The fear remained long after the war had ended. The strategic implications of Operation Starvation influenced post-war military planning on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Soviet naval theorists, studying the campaign's effectiveness, developed sophisticated mining capabilities as a central element of their sea denial strategy. American planners incorporated lessons from the mining campaign into contingency plans for future conflicts, recognizing the potential of aerial mining to control maritime choke points with minimal resource commitment. Captain James Harpole, who served on the U.S. Navy's post-war strategic planning staff, noted, "What we accomplished against Japan with comparatively primitive mines suggested the potential for even more effective operations with modern technology. A relatively small force of aircraft equipped with advanced mines could effectively neutralize an enemy's maritime commerce or naval mobility at a fraction of the cost of direct engagement." This asymmetric approach offered particularly valuable options against adversaries with geographical vulnerabilities similar to Japan's. For the air crews who executed Operation Starvation, recognition came slowly. While bomber crews who participated in high-profile raids against Japanese cities received immediate recognition, the mine-laying missions were often viewed as secondary efforts despite their strategic impact. It would take decades for military historians to fully appreciate the outsized contribution these missions had made to Japan's defeat. Many veterans of the mining campaign went to their graves without proper acknowledgement of their role in one of history's most effective air operations. Colonel James Maxwell, who commanded one of the B-29 groups involved in the mining operations, reflected on this disconnect years later. "We knew we were doing important work, but it lacked the immediacy and visibility of the city bombing missions. You drop a mine, it disappears beneath the waves, and maybe weeks later you hear that a ship hit it somewhere. There were no dramatic photos of explosions or burning cities for the newspapers back home. The results were statistical rather than visual. Tonnage sunk, shipping declined by certain percentages. It's hard to create popular recognition for that kind of warfare, however effective it might be." The human stories behind the campaign revealed the complex interplay between technological warfare and individual experience. For B-29 crews, mine-laying missions offered a strange moral ambiguity compared to city bombing. While they recognized the strategic necessity of their missions, many found comfort in the fact that mines primarily targeted military shipping rather than civilian populations. The distance, both physical and psychological, between the act of dropping a mine and its eventual detonation created an emotional buffer that bombing missions lacked. Lieutenant Robert Whitman, a B-29 navigator on mining missions, expressed this sentiment in his wartime journal. "When we bomb a city, I can see the explosions, the fires starting. I know immediately that people below are dying because of what we've just done. With the mines, it's different. We drop them and go home. Maybe they'll sink a warship, maybe a freighter. Maybe they'll just force ships to take longer routes or stay in port. But the direct connection between my actions and someone's death is less immediate, less visible. I can't decide if that makes it easier or just different." For Japanese civilians affected by the campaign, the experience often manifested as a gradual worsening of already difficult conditions rather than the immediate trauma of bombing raids. Hunger increased incrementally. Fuel for heating and cooking became progressively scarcer. Medicine for treatable conditions grew increasingly unavailable. The cumulative effect was devastating, but it unfolded over months rather than in a single catastrophic moment, a slow-motion disaster that affected millions. Kazuko Tsuji, who lived in Kobe as a teenager during the final months of the war, recalled the gradual decline. It was not like the air raids, where you could point to a specific day when everything changed. This was different. Each week brought a new reduction in what was available. First, the luxury items disappeared, then basic goods became scarce, then even necessities became impossible to find. By July, my mother would stand in line for hours for a small portion of sweet potatoes or beans. We began eating things we would never have considered food before: grass soup, boiled tree bark. The hunger was a constant companion, more reliable than any friend. The technical aspects of the mining campaign represented a remarkable achievement in operational planning. Mining operations required precise coordination between intelligence gathering, mission planning, mine assembly, and aircraft operations. Each mine had to be configured for specific water depths, target types, and environmental conditions. Delayed activation settings had to be calculated based on tidal patterns and Japanese mine-sweeping schedules. The entire operation represented a complex system optimized for maximum disruption with minimal resource commitment. Commander David Rosenthal, who served on the Umdiornd Bomber Command staff planning mining operations, emphasized the systematic approach. We weren't simply dropping mines randomly. Each mine was placed according to a carefully developed plan that considered shipping patterns, water depths, current flows, and Japanese countermeasures. We studied which harbors handled specific resources, which shipping routes were most critical to the Japanese war economy, and which choke points would create the greatest disruption if blocked. The entire campaign was an exercise in system analysis before that term was even in common use. The mines themselves represented the cutting edge of wartime technology. The Mark 25 magnetic mine contained sophisticated sensors that could measure minute variations in the Earth's magnetic field caused by a ship's metal hull passing overhead. The Mark 36 acoustic mine utilized hydrophones to detect and analyze propeller sounds, with filters designed to distinguish between different vessel types. The Mark 13 pressure mine measured the subtle drop in water pressure created as a ship passed overhead, a phenomenon known as the Bernoulli effect, triggering detonation at the optimal moment. Dr. Ellis Johnson, a civilian scientist who helped develop the mines used in Operation Starvation, explained their sophistication. These were essentially autonomous weapon systems capable of making targeting decisions based on sensor input. Each mine contained the equivalent of a primitive computer that could analyze signals and determine whether a passing vessel matched specific parameters. This allowed us to create mines that would ignore minesweepers but detonate under cargo vessels or target ships of specific sizes while allowing smaller craft to pass safely. For the 1940s, this represented remarkably advanced technology. The long-term environmental impact of the mining campaign would not be fully understood for decades. While most mines were designed with self-deactivation mechanisms that would render them harmless after a specified period, not all functioned as intended. Occasional post-war incidents involving long-dormant mines continued into the 1950s, with several fishing vessels damaged or sunk by previously undetected ordnance. The final mines from the campaign were not officially declared cleared until 1958, 13 years after the war's end. For Japan's post-war reconstruction, the legacy of the mining campaign created both challenges and opportunities. The immediate task of reopening shipping lanes was essential for addressing severe food shortages in the immediate aftermath of surrender. American occupation authorities prioritized mine-sweeping operations, providing equipment and technical expertise while employing Japanese maritime personnel in the actual clearance work. This cooperation represented one of the earliest examples of U.S.-Japanese collaboration that would eventually develop into a strong post-war alliance. Admiral Chester Nimitz, reviewing the campaign's effectiveness in a 1946 assessment, observed, "The mining of Japanese waters achieved results far out of proportion to the effort expended. Had the war continued, we planned to increase the mining effort substantially, with projections suggesting that Japan's inter-island shipping would have ceased entirely by November 1945. Few military operations in history have achieved such asymmetric effects, a relatively small commitment of resources producing strategic results that might otherwise have required vastly greater investment. Perhaps the most significant legacy of Operation Starvation lay in its demonstration of air power's evolving role in maritime warfare. Traditional naval theory had long held that control of sea lanes required surface vessels, a resource-intensive approach that limited naval operations to nations capable of building and maintaining large fleets. The aerial mining campaign demonstrated an alternative. A relatively small force of land-based aircraft could effectively control maritime spaces without requiring a surface presence, fundamentally altering the economic and strategic calculations underlying sea power. General Curtis LeMay, who initially viewed mining operations with skepticism but became a convert after seeing the results, remarked in his post-war memoirs, "The mining campaign represented a revolution in maritime warfare. With a minimal commitment of resources, just one bomb group out of the many under my command, we effectively neutralized Japan's maritime transportation system. The strategic implications were profound. Air power had demonstrated that it could control the sea without requiring traditional naval forces. This capability would reshape military planning for decades to come." As the Cold War emerged in the late 1940s, both American and Soviet military planners incorporated lessons from Operation Starvation into their strategic doctrines. The Soviets, recognizing their relative naval weakness compared to Western powers, developed extensive mining capabilities as a central element of their sea denial strategy. American planners maintained aerial mining as a capability particularly valuable against adversaries with maritime vulnerabilities similar to Japan's. In the decades following World War II, technological advancements would build upon the foundation established by the mines used against Japan. The development of influence mines with multiple sensor types, sophisticated signal processing capabilities, and programmable decision algorithms would create weapons of even greater effectiveness and selectivity. Modern naval mines can distinguish between different vessel classes, activate only after specific ships have passed, or remain dormant until deliberately triggered by external signals, all concepts that trace their lineage to the mines deployed in Operation Starvation. For military strategists, the campaign offered enduring lessons about asymmetric warfare and the targeting of systemic vulnerabilities. Rather than attacking Japanese military forces directly, the mining campaign targeted the logistical foundation that supported those forces, an approach that produced disproportionate effects relative to the resources committed. This concept of attacking an adversary's supporting systems rather than their combat forces directly would influence military thinking from Vietnam to the modern era. Dr. Richard Layton, a military historian who studied the campaign extensively, noted, "Operation Starvation demonstrated that modern industrial nations have systemic vulnerabilities that can be exploited without directly engaging their military forces. By targeting Japan's maritime transportation network, the U.S. effectively induced systemic collapse in the Japanese war economy without having to destroy every factory or defeat every military unit. This approach, targeting critical nodes and links in an adversary's support system, would become a central concept in modern strategic thinking. For the Japanese people, the legacy of the mining campaign manifested in a post-war determination to never again be vulnerable to maritime blockade. This strategic imperative would shape Japan's economic development for decades, influencing everything from resource stockpiling policies to the development of a massive merchant marine to ensure secure access to vital imports. Japan's post-war emergence as a leading shipbuilding nation reflected not only economic priorities, but deep-seated security concerns born from the wartime experience of maritime isolation. Toshihiko Nakamura, who served in Japan's post-war Ministry of Transportation, explained this connection. The memory of starvation caused by the American mining campaign influenced our national planning for decades. We developed extensive strategic reserves of essential materials, built one of the world's largest merchant fleets, and invested heavily in port infrastructure, all with the implicit goal of preventing a repeat of the 1945 experience. Even today, Japan's approach to maritime security and resource acquisition cannot be fully understood without recognizing this historical trauma. The human cost of the mining campaign would never be precisely quantified. Unlike bombing raids, which produced immediate and visible casualties, the effects of maritime blockade manifested indirectly through malnutrition, disease, and industrial collapse. No monument lists the names of those who starved due to food shipments that never arrived, or who died from treatable illnesses because medical supplies couldn't reach hospitals. Yet historical evidence suggests the cumulative human toll likely exceeded that of many better-known military operations. Dr. Hiroshi Yamamoto, a Japanese historian who studied the social impact of the mining campaign, observed, "The Americans found a way to wage war that maximized strategic effect while minimizing their own casualties and direct civilian deaths. Yet the suffering caused was no less real for being indirect. Thousands died from malnutrition and related diseases in the final months of the war, deaths directly attributable to the collapse of maritime transportation. This represents a different kind of warfare, less visible, but potentially more devastating in its systemic effects." For naval strategists in the post-war era, Operation Starvation offered a compelling case study in sea denial achieved through minimal resource commitment. Traditional naval blockades required committing substantial surface forces that remained vulnerable to counterattack and weather conditions. The aerial mining approach allowed a relatively small force to create persistent effects over vast maritime areas with minimal ongoing commitment. This asymmetric advantage would influence naval planning throughout the Cold War and beyond. Captain William Hayward, who taught at the U.S. Naval War College in the 1950s, emphasized this lesson. The mining campaign against Japan demonstrated that control of maritime spaces no longer required traditional naval dominance. A relatively small force of aircraft, properly equipped and intelligently employed, could effectively neutralize an adversary's maritime capabilities, regardless of the size or capability of their naval forces. This fundamentally altered the economic and strategic calculations underlying sea power, creating options for nations that could never hope to match their adversaries ship for ship. As historiography of World War II evolved in subsequent decades, Operation Starvation gradually received greater recognition for its strategic contribution. Early post-war narratives had focused on dramatic events like the atomic bombings, major fleet engagements, and island invasions, with the mining campaign often relegated to footnote status despite its effectiveness. By the 1970s, more comprehensive analyses began acknowledging the campaign's outsized impact on Japan's ability to continue the war. This reassessment was fueled partly by the declassification of Japanese wartime records that revealed the full extent of the crisis caused by the mining campaign. Minutes from Imperial Japanese Navy staff meetings, once considered state secrets, showed growing panic about the inability to counter American mines or maintain essential maritime traffic. Economic reports documented the cascading effects of resource shortages on military and civilian sectors. Personal accounts from Japanese officials confirmed the psychological impact of watching their nation's maritime lifelines systematically severed. For the veterans who had participated in the mining campaign, this belated recognition brought a measure of satisfaction. Many had completed their service, feeling that their contributions had been overshadowed by more visible operations, despite knowing the strategic significance of their missions. The historical reassessment validated what they had long understood, that their low-profile missions had played a crucial role in bringing the war to a conclusion. Colonel Robert Maxwell, who commanded a B-29 squadron that specialized in mining operations, reflected on this shift in historical perspective. For years after the war, when people asked what I did in the Pacific, I'd explain about the mining missions. The typical response was polite interest, followed by questions about the real bombing campaign. It was frustrating to know how effective our operations had been while receiving so little recognition. It's gratifying that history has finally caught up with what we knew all along, that those mines we dropped in the darkness played a crucial role in ending the war. The technological innovations developed for Operation Starvation would influence military systems far beyond naval mines. The concept of autonomous weapons capable of making targeting decisions based on sensor input would eventually lead to modern smart weapons. The practice of programming weapons with delayed activation or variable sensitivity settings would become standard features in advanced munitions. The systematic approach to targeting critical infrastructure nodes rather than enemy forces directly would inform strategic bombing doctrines in subsequent conflicts. Dr. Nathan Rogers, a military technology historian, traced these connections. The mines used in Operation Starvation represented early examples of what we would now call autonomous weapon systems. Each mine contained sensors to gather data, processing capabilities to analyze that data, and decision algorithms to determine whether to detonate. This basic architecture, sense, process, decide, act, underlies virtually all modern smart weapons, from guided missiles to drone systems. What began as relatively simple influence mines in 1945 evolved into the precision-guided munitions that define contemporary warfare. For Japanese maritime communities, the psychological impact of the mining campaign lingered for years after the war's end. Fishermen approached familiar waters with newfound caution, aware that undetected mines might still lurk beneath the surface. Harbor pilots developed new approaches to guiding vessels through channels that had once been mined, sometimes altering traditional routes that had been used for generations. Even after official declarations that waters had been cleared, a residual wariness remained, an invisible psychological barrier left behind by physical weapons long since removed. Masaki Tanaka, who began his career as a harbor pilot in Kobe in the early 1950s, described this lingering effect. Even years after the Americans and our own minesweepers had declared the water safe, old captains would insist on avoiding certain areas where mining had been heavy during the war. They would say, better to take the longer route than risk finding the one mine they missed. This wasn't rational. The waters had been thoroughly swept, but the psychological impact remained powerful. The Americans had succeeded not just in mining our waters, but in planting seeds of doubt that continued influencing maritime behavior long after the war ended. In military academies worldwide, Operation Starvation became a standard case study in asymmetric warfare and effects-based operations. The campaign demonstrated how relatively modest resource commitment, applied intelligently against critical vulnerabilities, could produce strategic effects far beyond what direct confrontation might achieve. This lesson, that targeting systemic weaknesses often proves more effective than attacking strength directly, would influence military thinking from Vietnam to modern conflicts in the Middle East and beyond. General William Mitchell's early advocacy for air power's potential to control maritime spaces, once dismissed as exaggerated, found powerful validation in the mining campaign's success. Mitchell had argued in the 1920s that land-based aircraft could effectively neutralize naval power at a fraction of the cost of maintaining surface fleets, a claim that Operation Starvation demonstrated convincingly. The campaign thus represented not only an operational success, but a conceptual vindication for early air power theorists who had envisioned such applications decades before they became reality. As the final mines were officially declared cleared in 1958, Operation Starvation passed fully into history, its physical remnants removed from Japanese waters, but its strategic lessons permanently embedded in military thinking. The campaign had demonstrated the potential for air power to control maritime spaces, the vulnerability of island nations to logistical strangulation, and the effectiveness of targeting critical infrastructure rather than military forces directly. These lessons would influence military planning, technological development, and strategic thought for generations to come. In the final analysis, Operation Starvation stands as one of history's most effective demonstrations of strategic air power, not through spectacular destruction, but through the methodical exploitation of fundamental vulnerabilities. With minimal losses to attacking forces, limited collateral damage compared to direct bombing, and remarkable efficiency in resource utilization, the campaign achieved effects that would have otherwise required vastly greater investment of lives and material. This combination of effectiveness, efficiency, and relative humanity represents a standard against which subsequent air campaigns would be measured, often unfavorably. Admiral Takeo Kurita, who had commanded Japanese naval forces at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, offered perhaps the most fitting epitaph for the campaign in his post-war assessment. The Americans found our Achilles heel and exploited it with minimum effort for maximum effect. No single battle, no heroic last stand could counter what they accomplished with those mines. They defeated us not through superior bravery or fighting spirit, but through superior understanding of our fundamental vulnerabilities. For an island nation dependent on maritime commerce, there could be no effective answer to such a strategy once our naval power had been broken. The mines did not defeat our fighting men, they defeated Japan itself.